But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's begin it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
There's a lot of this,
Yeah, could not agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Can it looks like my microphone is working now.
Okay.
Can you hear me all right, Lauren?
Yeah, I can hear you
Oh,
perfectly
good.
fine.
Okay. Okay. This is the weirdest one I've seen so far. And I always update the laptop that I do this on, like right before, maybe a few hours before showtime, at most, like the morning before showtime. So like it's definitely not needing an update, and when showtime happens, and I do that because I don't want to deal with the one time we had a forced update in the middle of the show, and it interrupted the middle of the show. We had to start a new live stream and everything. So that was quite fun. And I don't ever want to deal with that again. So I usually update like immediately prior to the stream. And I did that, and apparently the update screwed up some kind of settings in OBS, because I had to go in and go into settings and remove my microphone and then put it back. So that, I don't know what the heck, some stupid way that the computer talks to itself didn't work because of the way Microsoft changed the way the computer talks to itself.
Oh my god.
Thanks, Mr. Gates. That helped a lot. I'm glad I don't have to go in for a work shift tonight. I'm already tired now. I'm not an IT specialist. I'm a smartass. I'm a professional smartass. Come on. This makes me feel like a professional dumbass. So, hello. And welcome to... Yep, we are back. Welcome to the HBR Talk 310 episode, Evolution of Suffrage After the U.S. Revolution. I was trying to tell everybody right before I discovered that there was no sound, that tonight we're going to have an interesting discussion. And I didn't... The blog isn't working either, so there's no blog post. So I didn't get to have Allison share the blog post. So I did kind of post something inflammatory on my account, and link to the YouTube, or to the Rumble stream. So we'll see if we get any hate listeners on Rumble. We might not. But once the episode is over, I'll have to tell you guys about the video. I don't know. I don't think I should play it on YouTube. It's a little bit inflammatory for YouTube. So
no, come on, it's great.
We might get banned. But I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with Nonsense Annihilator Lauren Brooks, and tonight we're gonna jump through a series of hoops through time. So put on your seatbelts, because this can be a bumpy ride. It's already been bumpy. But before we do that, we gotta do what we gotta do. As always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthatip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content, as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. So, last week, we went through the American Revolution. We went through some of the aspects of the American Revolution and kind of explain why I say this country was kind of founded on conscription. And while conscription had some things about it that were different than, say, what it's like today, it still was, it affected every grown man, and it affected boys. We talked about the fact that the Revolutionary Army, although it was mostly comprised of grown men, included many boys in important capacities that made them targets of the British military. And some of them were as young as 7. Like, young as a first grader, doing a job in a war zone that could make you a target for the enemy to take out because of how important what you are doing was to the military that you were serving. And women acted mostly in support capacities, but they were much more active in support of that war effort than many women are today. And what we learned last week pretty much proved that there is no excuse for excluding women, for exempting women from conscription. Women can serve, and women have roles that we can fill, and we should. There's no excuse for us not to. Even if you don't think that women should be involved directly in the fighting, there are things that could be done by women that maybe aren't getting done as much as they should be because you're limited to half the population to choose from, and then only those that are eligible physically and mentally for the draft, and who aren't exempt for various reasons. So, yeah,
and then, I mean, I think, like, pregnancy comes into play, too, because should that happen while you're in the middle of a war, it's not very convenient.
Yeah, no. But, and then, of course, there's also the aspect of women, when they get activated, becoming pregnant as a reason to not be sent in, you know. Yeah. So, like that, right. I think that should be something that gets investigated every time, and if it's proved that it happened after marching orders came through or something, and was avoidable, that deserves penalties. And
absolutely.
That's, even if they don't make the woman abort, that still deserves penalties.
That would be similar to dodging the draft for guys. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go into the military, I had a classmate, actually, or a schoolmate rather, he was my classmate's younger brother, who joined. I want to say he went into the Navy or the Air Force, but he was in the military. He was in high school. He was signed up to start boot camp after he graduated. So in the fall of his senior year, he played football. So months and months before he was going to actually go into boot camp, right? But he got his leg broken during a game. And his recruiter basically told him, you get injured like that again, you'll be court-martialed.
Wow.
Yeah. Your military property once you enlist. You don't get to become inoperable. Like, not due to something that you chose to do on the side, not to a risk that you took, or, not for a risk that you took that you didn't have to take. A risk that you took for fun. So, that's how they treat men. So I don't see any problem with treating women the same way, especially given how much control we have available to us over our reproductive functions. Just saying. So let's get into this timeline. I've got that up and running, and I think, I still got the American Revolution in the middle of the screen. As you can see, it was not super long. But the fighting, one of the things that the text I have on this points out, somewhere in here, the fighting didn't end at the end of the war. It ended somewhat later. They surrendered. The British surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. So Americans had won their independence at that point. I have a typo in there. Oh no, I don't. But fighting didn't formally end until 1783. So the reason for something like that is, all right, we talked about before how hard it is to get information back and forth in an environment like the time of the Revolution. You didn't have cars and trucks and vans and airplanes. You didn't have the kind of ships that we have today. You didn't have electronic communications like we have today. Didn't have anything that could just instantly or quickly move information. It traveled on horseback.
Yeah.
Or in a carriage attached to a horse, or on foot. So it would take that long for the last people to realize, and the last troops to get their recall notifications as well. Like, we're not fighting anymore. Stop fighting. And
That's so crazy to think.
Yeah.
It's so crazy to think, like, no, you're done. You can stop now. You just haven't gotten the word yet.
Yeah, war's been over for 2 years. Stop fighting. Right?
Good
And it is
Lord.
funny, but at the same time, when you think about it in real terms, that's people
Yeah.
were still in little skirmishes and battles and, trying to get information and so on. And, Catherine Scully pointed out communications was an issue all the way up to World War II, maybe even after. So I have one family member that was in communications during the Vietnam War. And it's always been an issue, because you've had, with military service, you're not just dealing with trying to get messages to your colleagues, to your compatriots. You're trying to get messages to your army, your fighters, your generals, your officers, and so on, without telling the enemy what you're going to do before you do it, because you don't want to make your troops vulnerable. So, you have to use codes. You have to use all kinds of things, and we'll talk more about that in the process of this evolution, because there's something that took place in the United States that once again speaks to the importance and the vital connection, I guess, between conscription or military obligation and suffrage, right? So after the Revolution, let's see if I can expand this a little bit. I had to restart after the update. So during the Revolution and after the Revolution, you'll notice, you can see in the timeline here, we still have Irish Catholic disenfranchisement that we talked about before, where there were actual statutes that said that if you were Catholic, you couldn't vote in Ireland. And if you were Catholic, you couldn't hold office. So those continued. The rivalry between the East India companies, British and Dutch, continued. The French East India Company continued to exist. And so you have one of the earliest things that took place, if I can get this to open, there we go, was the Constitutional Convention. And the first thing you can see about this is they didn't have a readily formed government for America, like, before they went to war. This was something that happened over time, slowly, that the colonists got madder and madder about the stuff that was being done, the unfair taxation, the unfair restrictions, the monopoly that was given to the British East India Tea Company on a multitude of products, and how it affected the economy of the Americans. And so there was a great deal of discussion of what to do about these conflicts, but not what they were going to do if they won. Not so much a solid idea of what they were going to do if they won, right? They had a lot of thoughts on the matter, and of course it was all influenced by the Enlightenment. that was taking place in France. So there was a great deal of discussion about liberty, a great deal of discussion about individual rights and individual accountability. Packard Excellence gives us an interesting point. He says, at Badger Livestreams, it's well known that the Battle of New Orleans took place approximately 12 days after the U.S. and Great Britain had signed a peace treaty. Yes, and there were other battles as well. There were smaller ones, but that one was actually, like, I remember we talked about that one in elementary school. We didn't get much into what happened in it, just the fact that there were battles that were historically notable that took place after the peace treaty had been signed. But yeah, and yes, Quicksilverton, tea was taken more seriously in the 18th century than marijuana or even cocaine or opium. Except in China, where they were kind of being flooded with opium by the British East India Tea Company. So there was that. They were not very nice. But this took 4 months, 4 months and 5 days to hash out, how are we going to set up our government? And they looked at a lot of different things. And I have a link for that here. I'm not going to go over all of it, but they met over the course of 100 days. They formed the U.S. government out of multiple influences, and I think I talked about this maybe a couple of shows ago. One of the influences on how the U.S. government was formed was the government of the Six Nations, which was 6 tribes of Native Americans that had formed a loose confederacy in the Northeast, in like what we would call the New England states and the area of Canada that's north of that. And they had kind of like a Congress of chiefs. And it wasn't the same as what we do have. But they did have a system that was somewhat parliamentary. And then, of course, you also had the influence of the British parliamentary system.
You mean it wasn't like our ghetto Congress
No.
insulting each other's powdered wigs?
They had a really interesting way of doing things. They gendered voting in exactly the opposite way that it became gendered for a while in the UK and in the US, where only men could be chiefs, but only women could vote for them. So a man had to have the approval of the women of the tribe in order to be a leader. And okay. If you were in an environment where your whole existence revolved around man versus nature and not man versus man, that might be great.
Yeah.
But they did lose. Like they fought. Some of them fought on the British side. They also, some of them fought on the U.S. side, but they also, like I said, when the United States formed and the U.S. government began pushing the Native Americans further and further west and taking more and more land, that whole population was defeated. So gendering it didn't work, and insisting that only women got to decide who governed didn't work. It led to a situation where they just couldn't, even when they got weapons, even with guerrilla warfare that Americans didn't really know about until they were introduced to it by Native Americans. They still couldn't defeat the immigrants. So, let's see. OIC Nowie or Wowie, gave us $1 and said, Battle of New Orleans still counts if you compensate for lag. And yeah, lag would be a good way to describe it. General Jackson wasn't a bad gamer, it was just the ping. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Right? The ping took a little bit longer back in the day. But yeah, the convention established the Electoral College as a solution to like the whole mob vote thing. So what we live in the United States is not a pure democracy. People think we are in a pure democracy, but we're not. Pure democracy is, like they say, 5 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner tonight. But an electoral college. Sometimes we need an electrical one, especially when you have politicians like we have right now. Mangaka, believe it or not, yes, there are people who think we live in a pure democracy, and they talk about it that way. I have had conversations that, and I've had people double down on this too. When you go through and you explain the Electoral College and how it works and how it's a representative republic and how, if it was a pure democracy, every time there was a law or policy that came up that the federal government wanted to pass, everybody would have to vote on it.
Mm-hmm.
Then, no, your vote counts as it's a pure, that's what a pure democracy is. Don't understand anything. You have to understand, we're talking about the generation that ate Tide Pods.
Right.
Okay, so I know there's a lot of Zoomers out there going, I never ate any Tide Pods, but our generation. I'm a Gen Xer. We didn't eat Tide Pods. We didn't eat Tide Pods. We jumped out of trees and broke our legs, but we didn't eat Tide Pods. Okay.
Yeah. As far as generations go, they are the weakest link. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that'll continue. I think there were things that baby boomers said about us that were similar to that because there were things we didn't know, like how to use a slide rule. And there were things that we were not accustomed to, like most of our generation didn't get into using a stick shift, right? Using a manual transmission. I think I talked about that on HBR News too. But and we were the generation that was we were never going to move out of our parents' basements and blah blah blah. And yet at our age now, many of us were taking care of our parents until they passed away. And some still are because their parents survived the COVID crisis. So, I have hope for Gen Z that they can get up on their feet, and some of them are doing really well. There we go.
It's so funny because today one of my coworkers, young guy, right, was asked if he knew who we won our independence from. Oh, what country? He didn't know. He did not know.
Part of that is because when we won our independence, it was Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's the United Kingdom. And there's confusion among people. Is that a country or is that a confederacy? Or some sort of... And Britain is still a country. It's a country. Right? And it's connected to other countries, but that's also on our timeline. So, and Martin, I think that's Reberic, and maybe there's an accent over the C, so I hope it's still supposed to be a hard C. Said your generation ate Tide Pods. It just wasn't filmed and reported on the news. So there's one problem with that. My generation didn't have Tide Pods. They did not exist when we were kids. And when we were teenagers, we didn't have smartphones. And if you wanted, like, what passed for internet at the time was you got on your computer that had nothing but text on the screen. And you dialed on your modem. It's a soft okay, so it's Reberic. I hope I've got that right. Or is it like I had a person explained to me how my name was pronounced in Arabic was Hana with a hard H, and I don't do it very well because I have a lot of dryness, but it's supposed to be, you're supposed to hit the top of your soft palate with the back of your tongue when you say it, and the A's are supposed to be ahs and not as, so the English pronunciation is technically wrong, but it's what I'm used to, so. And, yeah. And it's probably pronounced Martine, says Quicksilver Tongue. Oh, you know what? Yeah, there's no T. It's because I'm dyslexic. I'm sorry. So it's Marin Riberic. Anyway, that's a neat name. Mr. 303 says Hannah in Arabic is pronounced as hummus. Yes. Which can be pretty good stuff just depending on how you prepare it. But if it's not prepared well, it sucks.
Yeah.
Like, there we go. But yeah, so I am sorry about getting your name wrong. I will in my defense, I live in Ohio, and we have a community just north of Dayton here that is pronounced Versailles. Versailles is spelled Versailles. Just that should explain everything right there.
Oh my god.
We have another community that part of the people in the state call Cairo, and part of the people in the state call it Cairo. And part of the people in the state call it Cairo. And it's the same town, and it's spelled Cairo. So, Cairo. Where are you from? Cairo. So, yeah, it's Ohio. Or if you're from farther north, it's Ohio. If you're from certain areas, it's Ohio. So, it would have been interesting if we had stayed Canadian. But there you go. So that's the Constitutional Convention. There was quite a bit of debate over what they were going to do in terms of how the government was going to form. There was a lot of debate about the Electoral College in particular, and there's a lot of debate about how the president would be elected. So at this point, there is no president. So just so you know, and they knew that we were going to expand, and they knew that the nation was going to be the people of the nation were going to live very differently depending on what part of the country they lived on, and simply because the topography here is quite different, and we have pretty much every type of land, in the United States, including permafrost, and including volcanoes. Like, we have desert, we have grassland, we have mountains, we have everything. We have seaside, we have swamps, we have drained swamps. There's one that we need to drain right now. But we've all kinds of different ways of living, and different problems that people have had to confront in their living environments all over the country. And so, yeah, it's in order to represent everybody, you have to have a different type of representation than just direct voting. So there was that. As this is going on, just a few years later, you have the first British penal colony in Australia. So the creation of this first British penal colony, we're still at 236 years ago from today, by the way, is January 26th, 1788, is when Captain Arthur Phillip guided a fleet of 11 British ships carrying convicts to the colony of New South Wales. This is how Australia started. New South Wales was run for quite a long time as a penal colony. You couldn't leave, but you could make a life there. You just had to be there. You just had to stay there. So they overcame a period of hardship and then began actually celebrating the anniversary with, great enthusiasm. And it eventually became commemorated as Australia Day. But again, it did start as a penal colony. So going to Australia was a punishment. And one day we'll have to look at what was so scary about Australia, because there was a lot of there's a lot of stuff in Australia that's deadly and painful and difficult to deal with and so on. And they basically sent them into like a killer world. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, Ohio, where they put the iron in their tire. Oh, yes. Where they put the iron in their tar. So that story, I used to work at a gas station. I had a guy come in and came up to speak to me, and he asked me a question, and I couldn't understand what he said. So what I heard was, "Sarong your iron machine." Shrong your iron machine. Like, what? What's an iron machine, and why do you want me to put a women's clothing garment on it? So obviously that wasn't what he was saying, because it didn't make any sense. So I asked him to repeat himself. Sarong your iron machine. What? So this continues for a little bit, and I'm finally like, I'm apologizing, I'm embarrassed. I'm like, look, I'm really sorry. I feel dumb asking this, but can you tell me what the machine you're asking about does? And he gets really impatient with me. He looks at me like I'm a moron, right? And finally says to me, "You use it to put iron in your tars." I'm like, he was asking what was wrong with our air machine. And it was dumb. And, there was what was wrong with our air machine was that when it got cold outside, it wouldn't take your credit card. It just didn't work. The reader would just stop reading for no reason. And they fixed that over time, but it didn't help him out in the moment, So you could use quarters in it, and that would work, but you couldn't pay with a card. And it was at that point where people started paying with their cards and everything. So, but yeah, that's Ohio for you. So we have more accents, I think, in just one state of the union sometimes than you find in an entire country. But as the first British penal colony in Australia is forming, and the Constitutional Convention is taking place, we have something called federal naturalization laws that are passed. So in 1790 is the first one, and the second one is 1795. The Federal Naturalization Acts set limits already, the first limits on immigrants becoming citizens of the United States. So it limited access to U.S. citizenship to white immigrants, in effect to people from Western Europe who had resided in the U.S. at least 2 years and their children under 21 years of age. So if your kid was over 21, then they would have to do the 2 years separately from you. Oh, and yes, I forgot to read the rest of Albert's. He also said, steel belted to a whole other level. What oh gosh. Water in your radiator. Yeah. Yep, and catch up women most affected. But hey, I had grandparents from New York, and my aunts didn't drink water. They didn't drink water either. They drank water.
Water.
So,
Yeah, that's how I hear people in up here in Connecticut say it. Water. It's even if it's so close to New York, it's still so different,
Yeah.
I say water.
It could be worse. My brother lived in one of the Carolinas for a short time, and they eat ass cream there. And
Ass
that
cream.
doesn't sound very appetizing at all. Hey man, you want some ass cream? No, I'm fine, thank you.
I don't know somebody that says like that.
But I would like a drink of water. Oh shit. So, but yeah, so you go back to this. The first thing they did after they won independence was you have to be here. You have to have been here for 2 years to become a citizen. If you weren't already here during the Revolution, right? Gotta be careful about that. And then 5 years later, they changed the residency requirements from 2 to 3 years and introduced the Declaration of Intention, in which the immigrant pledges under oath that they intended to renounce all allegiances to any foreign governments and become a United States citizen, a loyal United States citizen. And so that was the first change. Obviously, if you're not a citizen, you can't vote in most locations in the country. At that point in time, I think New Jersey was still letting non-citizens vote. But most of the states didn't. New Jersey was always a little different.
Yeah.
So, let's see here. We expand a little more because this is too tiny for me to open. So, these are parallel and I want to see. So, the next thing that happened was, as things took place in the U.S., somewhat inspired. Yep, NobaFan21 gave us $1 inside Australia was the OG Send Him to Detroit, except this time it was real. Yeah, very much so. Very, very real. And I can't imagine, like, we went to Australia in, I believe 2017, right? And in 2017, there were all kinds of jokes about drop bears and stuff. But Australia was not, in and of itself, a scary place. We didn't know how vicious the feminists were there. We didn't know we were going to get bomb threats there, too. It was not so scary for people from the States, because that our first convention here, our first conference here, was bomb-threated. So, yeah. But when we went to Australia, we all flew there and flew home. We stayed in Airbnb places that were clean and comfortable, in nice neighborhoods, decent places to be where there wasn't, I don't think Australia really has that much in terms of dangerous neighborhoods, but we certainly weren't in a situation where we had to confront nature very much, right?
Yeah, they use up all their energy just trying to survive, man. They don't have time to kill each other.
Right. I was hoping to see at least one scary-looking spider. I know that's a weird thing to hope for, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing for somebody from here. And yeah, Mangaka points out Australia doesn't have dangerous neighbors because the whole country is dangerous. Yeah, when it's
Yes.
that's probably true. But we didn't even see a big scary spider. Like, I saw a daddy longleg, but we got those here. And so it was a great trip. It was really safe, super safe, and I can't imagine what it must have been like being in an environment with all of the things that I've read about, all of the animals that are predatory and poisonous, and plants that are poisonous and can cause you such bad pain that animals that brush up against them actually commit suicide, which is kind of a rare thing in the animal world. And the spiders, like that had to have been unreal for them. Just pointing that out, because Australia also had a different pathway of evolution for their voting rights, because of how they became a country. And I should probably also do our super chows before I go on with this. So Meredith G gave us $5 and said, HBR News 310, honey for the Badgers. Let the suffrage discussion continue. And Richard Bier gave us $5 and said, in light of Gen X not moving out of the parents' home, I remember the opening of a sitcom where the kid just started out calling his parents because his car broke down. His dad asked him if he checked the oil, and the kid responded with, they put oil in it at the factory. And this becomes an argument circle, and he winds up moving back in with his parents. And there was a lot of that kind of portrayal of us when we were kids. There's a super chat here that I don't know if it was read or not, so I'm going to read it. This is from yesterday. Zapier gave us $10 and said, open your heart, close her mouth, and feel alive again. Introducing Man Up, the all-new revolutionary pill that will have you strutting with confidence like a lion. With every dose, pure, unadulterated testosterone will set you right. With Man Up, your woman won't know what hit her, or ask for a fresh one. Go ahead and take control. You deserve it. And then he gave us another $5 and said, not to be taken seriously, especially by anyone who thinks misogyny is a rampant crime against humanity, or that women should have voices in the workplace. Side effects may include, but are not limited to, increased libido with only one outlet available, sudden onset of superiority complex, loss of relationship, potential for developing a brood of helpless females who can't seem to survive without your protection and provision. Seek immediate medical attention if erection lasts for more than 4 hours. Use responsibly and in a loving relationship. That's about as close to the drug announcer that I can get. So that's got us caught up on those. And so trying to keep up because some of them are in the moment and they relate to things that we were talking about in the moment. But like right in the middle of this time frame of the federal naturalization laws, 1790 and 1795 in the U.S., after the first British penal colony has formed, is the storming of the Bastille in France. On July 14th, 1789, fears that King Louis XVI was about to arrest France's newly constituted National Assembly, which they were sort of heading toward a more libertarian system, and the royalty didn't like it. Basically, they were not happy about that. So led a crowd of Parisians to successfully besiege the Bastille, an old fortress that had been used since 1659 as a state prison. As a victory by ordinary Parisians over prominent representation of the king's coercive power, the event quickly became a symbol of revolutionary struggle, and it set off the French Revolution. So while that's taking place, then we have George Washington being elected in the United States. As right after the French Revolution was set off, December 28th, 1788. And it is, for some reason, it didn't format correctly. So, he was unanimously elected as the first president. 69 electoral votes. Won the support of each participating elector. No other president since has come into office with a universal mandate to lead. Several have claimed it, but yeah, no. But at this point in time, only 6% of the U.S. population was eligible to vote. Voting in most states would still have been limited to male landowners at that point. So, and of course, as this happens, it's limited specifically because it is citizens of the United States. It's limited specifically to white immigrants. You know, anybody that was already there that is a citizen falls into the rules that the states had set up for voting. But anybody that came to the United States after the Revolution and wanted to vote, they had to have been there for 2 years, and they had to be white. So there you go. And as this is going on, we still have the disenfranchisement of the Irish Catholics. Right, that continues. The French Revolution continues. In the midst of the French Revolution, we see the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in France, and there is a link to this, which I didn't take any text from it. I think it was because I wanted to actually look at it. And so you had a few things going on that led to the revolution, between widespread poverty, abuse of power by monarchy, and unequal rights in between the nobility and the commoners. There was a great deal of anger and resentment built up among the population. They were, I would say, probably also afraid that this was just going to continue forever. Enlightenment philosophy was a major influence, and what really set off confidence, I guess, in the revolutionaries in France was seeing the success of the American Revolution. Their ideas began to be implemented in the United States, and they began to see actual writing and actual laws, actual changes to the way the population was run. They began to see, how government would be if it wasn't what they were under, and instead was what they were considering, what they had been talking about. Used the Declaration of Independence as a template, and I don't want to sign up. So I wanted to point out a great deal of influence. During the Revolution, Ben Franklin actually had gone to France to ask for help, and France did join on the side of the colonists in the Revolution. So that
is that why we hate the French?
It's not why we hate the French. They joined on our side. And actually, there's a complicated history of why Americans don't get along with the French, and I think a lot of it is misconceptions, right? And differences in culture between how we look at everyday life. And people talk about France surrendering to Germany, but the whole time there was a revolutionary underground there as well, a resistance, and they risked their lives. They were just absolutely incredibly courageous people who deserve to be respected for what they did. So I don't like the black and white view of that. I think that just like in every other country, the people of France include people who are very courageous, people who are very strong, people who are very wise, and so on. And then there are also assholes, right, and fools. Every country has them. Mm-hmm. Every body has an asshole. You can't live without it. It might stink, but if you get rid of it, you have problems. So, it's kind of bullshit, the surrender meme. They were defeated, and it happens. Every country has won wars and lost wars, and that not every country can lose a war and still change the way their enemy behaves. Yeah. Right? But every country has won wars and lost wars. So, the surrender thing, I'm not buying it. I hope things get better in France than they are right now. I will say that. There are things that I'm seeing and hearing in the news that I feel for the French people. Like they're going backwards right now.
Yeah.
So that kind of breaks my heart. So obviously, there were different things going on in France than there were in the United States. There was a different mode and style of abuse of power by the monarchy, and some of the monarchs were kind of clueless, right? Although some of the things that were said about how clueless the monarchs were are not quite correct. Like Marie Antoinette probably never actually said "let them eat cake," but the cluelessness was there. She was like a teenager, so the French Revolution is continuing, and we have, and that was George Washington's election. So we have the first elections in Lower Canada in 1792. And anyone over 21 who owns sufficient property can vote, including women. So we hear a lot about women's suffrage in Canada. In 1792, in the first elections in Lower Canada, women could vote. And September 22, 1792, the National Convention is established in France about a month after the king is arrested. The monarchy is abolished, and the French Republic is established. The king is tried, and on January 21st, 1793, he is executed as a traitor.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's minor. That revolution is incredibly bloody and horrifying. The next thing that comes up, though, we finally come to the end of Irish Catholic disenfranchisement. 97 years. For 97 years in Ireland, if you were Catholic, you could not vote. You could be full-blooded Irish, born native to the country. Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, going all the way back to before the British Empire, going back before the Roman Empire even, you couldn't vote.
Unbelievable.
So, the parliamentary franchise in the Irish countries was specifically withheld by statute. This barred 80% of the adult male population in the counties of Ireland from exercising the vote in parliamentary elections.
Wow. Oh my God.
That 79 does not belong there. I think that is that's supposed to go to a bibliography reference. But restrictions on Catholics voting in the borough parliamentary elections had been in place before 1727 under local bylaws. Earlier restrictions had been placed on Catholic voters by requiring that they should take discriminatory oaths. And the discriminatory oaths were pretty bad. They had to, if I remember right, they had to deny the sovereignty of the Pope. There were two things they had to do that would have been considered blasphemy. So basically, they couldn't do it under their religious practices. It'd be like saying to a Muslim or a Jew, well, if you want to vote in our county, before you approach the polls, you have to, eat food that you're forbidden to eat in your religion, or you go to hell. You have to commit a sin of blasphemy that will send you to hell. You have to deny, the validity of your religious beliefs. But it was done to Catholics instead. And so then we had a whole set of laws that were passed. And I have links to those also in the timeline. I'm not going to go over all of them. But, and we have an act to restrain foreign education and an act for the better securing the government by disarming papists. Were both established in 1695. So the onset of the French Revolution made it more urgent to redress Catholic grievances. So the reason that Catholics got their voting rights back, or got their voting rights in Ireland, was because what was going on in France was so terrifying to the monarchy, to the powers that be, that they decided that they should not piss off the commoners. They saw what happened in the U.S., they saw what happened in France, and they said, okay, maybe we should be nicer. Let's see. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, simple, the French are ungrateful, cussy face. It has that, like, who think they are above North Americans, but I do agree that about the surrender meme, they got caught flat-footed. Yeah, I don't think they were expecting what happened at all. So, Irish Catholic disenfranchisement ends right about the time of something called the Wars of the Vendee, or Vendee. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this was terrifying. This was absolutely terrifying. So I'm going to take a look at this. Like, if you were... it's not terrifying so much if you weren't a part of it, but... Alright, come on, fingers. I don't want an announcement from you. There we go. So, counter-revolutionary insurrections in the west of France during the French Revolution is what these are. The important things to note about it: there's a general uprising starting with the Conscription Acts of February 1793. Then there's rioting. And then there is open revolt, like by the 13th. The uprising coincided with rising disaffection in Lyon, and in Marseille, and Normandy, and seriously threatened the revolution internally at a time when it had just suffered a military defeat. So the peasant leaders, joined by royalist nobles, took 3 towns, changed the name from the Catholic Army to the Catholic and Royal Army, and like started taking over other areas, right? There was almost this, if I remember right from... We didn't do like a whole discussion on world history in my high school history class. So if I remember right, this was what my teacher cited as this almost ended the revolution. But here we go. 15,000 rebels were killed in bloody battle. General warfare is now at an end. But several reprisals taken by the commander provoked further resistance. So here we have this, during this revolution, we have bloody battle after bloody battle taking place. And for the people that were involved, the uprisings of the royalists basically represented a threat that actually they're not going to get their freedom. Actually, you're going to be fighting and dying and committing murder and putting yourself in a position to be executed for your crimes if you don't die in battle against the royalists, and nothing will come of it. Right, so that would have been, in the midst of all that, that would have been terrifying. And this took place for quite some time. But in the midst of this, just as terrifying, you had the Reign of Terror, and this is the most famous part of the French Revolution. This how to explain this? Everybody was suspect. All right, so you had
Mm.
what I just described as going on. You had the ideas at the time, the evolution of ideas at the time was so rapid fire and such dramatic change that people were fired up. People were not just a little fired up, people were extremely fired up. And so when this took place, nothing was, there was no orderly here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it and then we're going to be done with it. It was everybody against everybody. And you had factions against factions. You had historic cancel culture is a great way to put it. OIC and WOWY said, historic cancel culture. Right? And Mr. 303 said, violence is the ultimate authority from which all other authority is derived. Both of those are relevant to this. Right.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Packard Tom has some context for the disenfranchisement of the Catholics. He says, Badger live streams. Do you realize that Bloody Mary tried to exterminate all Protestants in England and imprisoned Queen Elizabeth? Yes. And that was not Ireland, that was Scotland, but it is still all one sort of one big area that, all this stuff was taking place in. But, and Quicksilver Tongue says, roughly Vendee, Hannah, according to what remains of my high school French. Yeah, my high school French was kind of, it's the only class I had to study in the whole time I was in high school.
Really?
Yeah. I took calculus, I took chemistry and physics, I didn't have to... I could memorize that stuff. Was all fascinating to me, but when I took the French language, it wasn't that it wasn't interesting, it was just something about it was different enough from, not the vocabulary, but the vocabulary was different too, but there was something about it that made it different enough from English that I had a learning curve there that, I didn't have in anything else. So
yeah, there was a video that I watched. It was just a little YouTube short, but it was how French people would sound if they were actually speaking English, and the change, the way the sentences are structured is so weird. It's so I understand that it is a weird language.
Yeah, although
when I was. Go ahead.
It's not as different as Asian languages are.
Yeah.
Our grammar and their grammar is incompatible.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in high school, they taught French to the smarter kids.
Yeah.
And I think that was how it broke down. I don't know. My brother took French, but I was in Spanish. But I did take French in college, and I actually aced it. I found it really easy.
Yeah.
But it's for me. It's kind of the same with Spanish. I can pronounce the words very well, but holding a conversation is a completely different story.
Yeah.
I it's hard for me to do it. It's a skill that I wish that I had, and I should practice on it. I know I should, but
what I found when I was in school was that repetition and conversation in it made a big difference. So I took French in high school. I was in the what they called the gifted class when I was in elementary school. I don't like calling it that because they didn't have anything for art students that were gifted or music students that were gifted. They didn't really have anything for any of the students that were gifted in ways that were more creativity oriented. They just had something for students that were good at math and who progressed rapidly in the skill of reading, which you can say that's gifted, but it hardly covers the spectrum of ways in which kids are gifted, right?
Yeah.
So I don't like the name, right? But one of the things they did was have students from the high school Spanish class come in and teach us vocabulary. And that stuck with me for a long time. But I didn't take Spanish in high school. I took French. And then I took Spanish in college. And my professor was from Brazil. And so she had a very thick Brazilian accent. It was beautiful. It was so much fun to listen to her talk. She had a deep voice. And so I learned to speak with her accent in all of the things that I learned in that course. And since I didn't get to use it afterwards, it didn't stick with me. I would have to go back and relearn it all. But it was funny. The whole class spoke with her accent when we spoke Spanish. I grew up in a community where we had very little contact with people from Brazil, but quite a bit of contact with people from parts of Mexico. And there were a few different Mexican accents, and some of them spoke Spanish. And some of them wouldn't. They could, but they wouldn't. And they were stuck with English because they wanted to integrate. And but there were different accents, and so I recognized the difference in accent. So it was kind of neat. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about. And this is what I have written here. Infighting within the National Convention leads to I need to make this bigger. My eyes are sucking tonight. Leads to the radical. I'm like looking at that and seeing racial. The radical Montagnards taking power, and that's probably really butchered. I don't care at this point. This marks the start of the Bloody Reign of Terror, a year-long period in which suspected enemies of the revolution are killed in their thousands. During the Reign of Terror, at least 300,000 suspects were arrested. 17,000 were officially executed, and perhaps 10,000 died in prison or without trial.
Wow.
Right.
That's nasty.
Yeah. So, when you look at voting rights in France, this is something to consider as well. Right. We talk about voting rights being steeped in blood. This is a lot of blood.
Mm-hmm. Tragic.
And again, this is in the middle of the revolution. I don't think we covered the first elections in Lower Canada. Women could vote. So after the Reign of Terror is the Thermidorian reaction. So this is, I got a little bit more here about. The Thermidorian reaction refers to the period of the French Revolution between the fall of Maximilian, I guess this is Robespierre, on the 27th and 28th of July in 1794, and the establishment of the French Directory on the 2nd of November in 1795. The Thermidorians would have been... They abandoned radical Jacobean politics in favor of conservative ones. They wanted a restoration of the stable constitutional government and economic liberalism. But they conspired against Robespierre, and after his execution, this regime set about dismantling the Reign of Terror. So he would have been the leader driving the Reign of Terror. They purged Jacobeans from positions of power and violently suppressed their ideology. So they actually fought back and killed for this. This was referred to as the First White Terror, and this was an effort to return stability to France. They went into more conservative political ideas, and sort of returned to earlier phases of the revolution. There were they got more and more out there during the bloody parts of the revolution. They restored freedom of religion, reintroduced free market capitalism, They were heading toward more of a highly controlled system, I will say. They allowed the return of some aristocratic immigrants into France, and there was actually for a while a bit of an openly royalist sentiment. So people were actually accepting the idea of a monarchy, which there's still that this wasn't universally accepted. This was kind of, some people were all right, if it's, for peace, we'll do this, and some people were enthusiastic about it, and then other people were like, no, this is not the direction we want to go. So you had a lot of different outlooks in regard to that. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit because I think, it's a little bit before we have much more going on in the United States. But there's a whole bunch of things going on in France at the time. You can and also in other things as well. So we have the conscription law, called Jordan's Law. I don't know why I have that selected, but the First French Republic on September 5th, 1798, called for mass conscription of all unmarried men between the ages of 20 and 25 to help fight the War of the Second Coalition. So that was it's named after the sitting president of the council. I'm just distracted here. What do you mean YouTube wouldn't let you use the word condom?
What?
That's crazy. Okay.
Can't be right.
Yeah. Albert Nader says, gave us $5 Canadian and said, my dad was Protestant, my mom is Catholic, which means I can wear a rubber, but I can only unroll it halfway, which is about right. God, that's great. That's hilarious. So here we go, right? In the end phases of the revolution, they start with conscription. And so now you have the government being overthrown. November 9, 1799. Replaced with the French consulate. Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power, and in the view of many historians, this marks the end of the French Revolution. So, at the same time, or shortly thereafter here, the Dutch East India Company dissolves. So now there's no more rivalry between the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company because there's nothing to be a rival with. Company went bankrupt, and the government formally dissolved it on December 31st, 1799. So remember, these East India Companies, I think Mike compared them to the BlackRock of their day, which is pretty accurate. They had government-level power. So they could go in, they had their own armies. They could go in and take over an area and exploit it economically, and the people there really couldn't do a whole lot about it. The French East India Company continued. That continued to exist. So we have the time span of the rivalry between the British and Dutch East India Companies was 198 years. Almost 199 years. And then the French East India Company, you can see it existed for 135 years.
Wow.
And then this was long-standing. And so after all of this has taken place, so now the bloody French Revolution has ended, and I thought I had put in some things about the advent of the French government, but I don't think I did. I think I stopped at Napoleon. We now have some changes taking place back in the Jacobins. Well, yeah, that would be appropriate since it is French. So it would be, instead of Jake, it would be Jock. I'm going to really briefly, I don't think I'm going to actually open this, because it's just, this is for reference. There is a link. New Hampshire became the first state to say, well, you don't have to be a landowner to vote.
In 1806.
Yep, 1806. And this one is really weird, 1807. So, New Jersey, when New Jersey, became a state at the beginning, after the revolution, anybody could vote. Everybody could vote. You didn't have to be an American citizen to vote in New Jersey. You could be a woman and vote. You could be a man and vote. You could be any race, any ethnic background. They were lucky people weren't letting their dogs vote in New Jersey.
I'm sure a few of them probably did in some districts. Jeez.
But then there was this election where both of the candidates were accusing the other of fraud. Both of the candidates were accusing the other of stealing the election. Everybody was claiming that people were voting multiple times, and everybody was claiming that the women's vote was fraudulent. That there were a lot of men that were dressing up as women and voting, and a lot of the claims were true. The really bad thing about this election, so there were people that voted multiple times by going in dressed as men and voting, and then going back in dressed as women and voting. So the election itself at that time was just completely worthless. They didn't have any kind of election security. They didn't know who voted how many times. They didn't none of that, right? So the New Jersey passed a new law. This is December 16th, 1907. See if it shows. Yeah, it shows. Okay. Following this highly contentious election, the Democratic-Republican Party, which eventually over time, years later, became the Democrat Party, they passed a law in New Jersey that you had to be free, white, and male over the age of 21 in order to vote. So that was New Jersey putting all kinds of restrictions. They took voting rights away from minorities, they took voting rights away from non-citizens, they took voting rights away from people under the age of 21, and away from women. And let's see, then we have, as this is happening, here's where the War of 1812 happens. And again, this is where the U.S. is said to have lost this war, but it was started over the impressment of American sailors into the British military to fight British wars that America wasn't involved in. And Britain never used this method of conscription again after this war. So, I don't know how many countries can lose a war and still make their enemy change what they went to war to make them change, but we did. I say we like I was around at that time. So I don't think there's not much below the line here, but the French East India Trading Company still exists, and I believe the British one does too. I need to go back and fix that, because I know I had a timeline for that there as well. So now we have in the U.S. the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's probably not, the Hidalgo is probably not right. And why won't it open? There we go. This was signed on February 2, 1848, ended the war between the United States and Mexico. By its terms, Mexico ceded 55% of the territory, including the present-day states California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona, Colorado, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Mexico also relinquished all claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande as the southern boundary in the United States. So previously we were at war with them at that time. Now, let's see, we aren't up to 1832 yet. Okay. This is where we have New York, December 31, 1822, decides that you have to have $250 of property, worth of property, to be able to vote if you're black. So there wasn't that same property requirement if you were white. So that was kind of like a Jim Crow law before Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And they had a bunch of different states did different things like that in the South. But New York often, like, you hear people talk about New York like it was always better. But it wasn't.
Mm-mm. Maryland, I don't know what type of time you you didn't allow the youth to vote? Oh, my Lord.
I didn't want to open the link there. Let me close that. But yeah. And then January 5th, 1826, Maryland passed a law allowing Jews to vote. Prior to that, they could not.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, New Jersey was like Chicago. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I mean, now this brings up a question for me, because this is after the Constitution was drafted.
Right.
Well, and now maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm talking completely out of school. I'm not a history student. I really hated this stuff. Now it's interesting, but
yeah,
I hated it back then. But so where does the whole separation of church and state come in if you're not allowing people to vote based on their religious affiliation?
That's certainly a valid question, right?
I mean,
what we were taught, though, if you look at the wording of the amendment, it doesn't include an admonition that there will be separation of church and state. The purpose was to separate the church from the state, but the actual amendment pretty well states that the state will not establish a church, so the state doesn't control the church, and the church doesn't control the state. And so the actual application of it, it's been called into question from almost day one throughout the history of the country. And if I remember right, I'm actually going to look and see what was the date. Alright, that computer's being... Shit, there we go. So the Constitution, the First Amendment in particular, there was only, let's see, 37 years old at that point. So yeah, for that. That really wasn't that long. I mean... Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, so Maryland had to pass a law to allow Jews to vote. Now, there might have been a couple of other reasons for that. There may have been not a statute, but a practice rather than, a statute. It's like, so they may have had to pass a law that says you can't stop people from voting just because they're Jews.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So then we have the June 1st, 1828. And now, to know this is important to know. In 1844, at least 7 women voted in the West Halton district of Canada West, now Ontario, in the United Province of Canada, now Ontario and Quebec election. The candidate who lost the West Halton election called for a parliamentary investigation claiming women voting was election fraud. In June 1, 1828, women were disenfranchised by law. So although the election results were not overturned, the incident led to the 1849 motion passed in the United Province of Canada Parliament that proclaimed and decreed that no woman shall have the right to vote at any election. So they completely disenfranchised women. Let's see. At that point. So that's Canada. And we have a skinny thing here that... Oops, wrong direction. We want it bigger so I can actually click on it. There we go. Then we have, in France, the July Revolution. The July Revolution happens in 1830. This is like, we talked about this before when we were talking about... This is actually what got me started on this timeline, too. So we were talking about how the Great Reform Act of 1832 got passed in Britain, right? So the Great Reform Act was influenced by this July Revolution. And fortunately it was not bloody like the original French Revolution was. So it led to the overthrow of King Charles X, the French Bourbon monarch, and the ascent of his cousin, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans. It's probably pronounced differently than it is here in the United States, but this is what I'm familiar with. So, and this was again about Catholicism, if I remember right. Yeah. Charles X of France took far more conservative lane than his brother Louis. He attempted to rule as an absolute monarch and reassert the power of the Catholic Church in France. This pissed everybody off. Acts of sacrilege in churches became punishable by death. Freedom of the press was severely restricted. He tried to compensate the families of the nobles who had their property destroyed during the French Revolution. It was like he was trying to get taken out of power.
Yeah, jeez.
It's all right, you rabble-rousers. You've had your fun, but now we're gonna... Oh, what do you got there? Didn't go well for him. So in 1830, the discontent caused by these changes, by his authoritarian nomination of the Ultra Prince de... Oh, good grief. I'm Polignac? I don't know if the G is even pronounced, as minister, culminated in an uprising in the streets of Paris, known as the 1830 July Revolution, or the Glorious Revolution. The 3 glorious days. Charles was forced to flee, and Louis Philippe, and it was who had voted the death of his cousin. Oh wow! Ascended to the throne. Like these guys were just completely violent and bloody all around. But yeah, Louis Philippe ruled not as King of France, but as King of the French. A very important distinction, because he basically was calling himself the people's king, and not the authority over the people. Which is kind of interesting. It was made clear that his right to rule came from the people and was not divinely granted. He ruled with their consent. So there was quite a bit there. And he revived the I don't know how it's pronounced in French, but it looks like maybe tricolor or tricolor as the flag of France. And that was a symbol of the revolution, so that made a big difference. So that scared the piss out of the British monarchy and the British Parliament, and we get the Great Reform Act of 1832, which UK government's National Archives describes or summarizes as follows. The Reform Act became law in response to years of criticism of the electoral system from those outside and inside Parliament. Elections in Britain were neither fair nor representative. In order to vote, a person had to own property or pay certain taxes to qualify, which excluded most working class people. There were also constituencies with several voters that elected 2 MPs to Parliament, such as Old Sarum in Salisbury. In these, quote, rotten boroughs with few voters and no secret ballot, it was easy for those standing for election to buy votes. Industrial towns like Manchester or Birmingham, which had grown during the previous 80 years, had no members of Parliament to represent them. So they had huge areas of population for the time period that were just completely unrepresented. And then they had these little villages that had, maybe 10 families, and they would send 2 members to Parliament. And the 2 members could buy those votes and keep their seats regardless of how they behaved in Parliament. So, in 1831, the House of Commons passed the Reform Bill, but the House of Lords, dominated by the Tory party, defeated it. The Tory party was also the party that did not want to give any concessions to the American Revolution, or the pre-revolution, the colonist demands for fair treatment. So that they didn't like that either. So this was followed by a series of riots, serious disturbances in London, Birmingham, Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Yeovil, Sherborne, and Exeter and Bristol. So the page further states that the act itself only gave the franchise to middle-class men. So it still didn't give the franchise to the poor. Some other things to understand. Ryan Miller's page or paper, A Dire Need for Parliamentary Reform, or the Role of Elite Fears in Britain's Great Reform Bill of 1832, which we went over, I think, before, explains that during the debate between the Whigs and the Tories, they brought up the fear of revolution launched by the French Revolution, catalyzed by these protests that were taking place. And while they were discussing this, he explains in his abstract here, Whig MPs insisted Britain reform or face revolution. Tory MPs downplayed any immediate threat, and then massive unrest materialized in Bristol, and the conversation just radically changed. The peasants started revolting, and they were like, "Oh, well, they might do that. Okay, let's have a discussion about these voting rights."
Yeah.
And again, it's like right after France had their revolution. They had a pathway after the revolution. They were governed. They had still had their royalty and so on, and they had another little revolution in the middle of peacetime afterward, like right before this.
They can't make up their minds. The hell.
And the middle class had changed from what it had been previously as well. Like, they had access to new things that made their lives different. So their discontent was influenced, I think, partly by those changes. And at the same time, they had the Industrial Revolution changed 2 things for the middle class. Like, first of all, it used to be comprised of people who worked with their hands and owned their own businesses, and so on. And you had more and more people going to work in factories and in areas of resource gathering for factories, right? And so it changed the way labor was done. It changed the poor class as well, because there's a lot of automation that was run by people who didn't get paid very much to do it. And so you had this massive change in the way people's time was spent, massive changes in the way they perceived their safety and their interest in decisions the government made. For instance, one of the things that, and I don't know if I put it on the timeline, let me look and see if I did, there was legislation that was passed in regard to corn, the sale of corn, that had a profound effect on part of the British economy, that pissed people off and caused a protest, and affected the way the environment in which voting rights were decided upon. I don't think I did include. I should include that in the timeline. Right. But it's not. It might be later, and I might just be mistaking it for something that took place this early. But the Great Reform Act happens, and then a few years later, Canada abolishes slavery in 1834, August 1st, 1834. So they're actually freed as a result of passage of the Slavery Abolition Act by the British Parliament. And then, let's see, we have a large area here where not a lot is happening. And then, yeah, the Act of Union in Canada takes place, which was passed by British Parliament in July 1840 and proclaimed 10 February 1841. And it united the colonies of Upper Canada and Lower Canada under one government, creating the Province of Canada.
Jeez, how many people actually lived in Upper Canada? What, like 10 people?
Well, they would have had to brave some pretty bad weather.
Yeah.
You know. Right. A couple of years later, a New South Wales Constitution Act of 1842 in Australia happens. Mm. So, as all of this is going on, right, there is still, as these are taking place, voting in the United States is almost all done by white people. Only about 6% of the population can vote. Under the law that was just passed in Britain, I think less than 4% of the British population could vote. So we're still looking at most suffrage is most of the population is denied suffrage. New South Wales growing demands resulted in the British Parliament passing New South Wales' first Constitution Act, made the first significant step toward responsible government in New South Wales. So it's the first step toward it going from being a penal colony to an actual just a colony. And this is when they had their first elections. Very restricted franchise. And you had to have property worth £200 or more, or pay annual household rent of at least £20. So a very small percentage of the population. Remember, they went there with nothing. People would arrive there with nothing. You know, unless they were guards, right, employees. So now we have things happening in different countries, and we have a whole cluster again. So as Australia is sort of moving forward toward becoming a nation, government force of British soldiers and Victorian police stormed the Eureka Stockade, and there was a battle, less than an hour, by the end of which 33 miners and 5 soldiers were dead. It led to fairer goldfield system with a license replaced by cheaper miners' right, giving miners the right to vote. That's miners as in people who dug coal out of the ground, not children. So this is seen as the first step, one of the first steps to developing the Australian democracy. Then they have, in 1865, open sesame, the Electoral Act of 1865, when South Australia became the first state where all men were given the vote, universal male suffrage, making it one of the most democratic places in the world at the time. All men, not all white men. So they were ahead of the United States right there, because we weren't that advanced. In fact, we had some things coming up that were pretty despicable in our voting history. And they also introduced the secret ballot, which, the nice thing about the secret ballot is that your neighbors don't get mad at you for who you voted for unless you tell them, because you don't have to. And right after that, we have something called the Gradual Civilization Act in Canada. This was a government policy that basically was designed to destroy the culture of the indigenous people. They were re-educating them, like re-education camps type re-educating. They created a school system that has to this day, there's a huge divide over it. So, and then there was a lot of abuse that took place. Although some of the abuse that was alleged to take place was kind of debunked by the fact that where there were supposed to be bodies, there were no bodies. But it does not mean that there was no abuse. It's simply a matter, because trying to destroy an entire culture is, in and of itself, abuse. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, look up Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe if you want to learn about the end of slavery in Canada. Upper Canada is Ontario, lower is Quebec. And I want to make sure I haven't missed any further Rumble rants. It just, for a minute, I was on a different tab, and then I forgot to close the tabs. So, better do that really quick. There we go. Sorry about that. So this was something, like, we hear a lot about what the United States did to Native Americans. Canada was similar. It had a different pathway, but similar in terms of erasing the culture. And when we hear about the genocide of Native Americans, a lot of that involved war, actual battles, and people getting killed in battle. And a lot of it also involved intermarriage. So there was not so much a prevention of continued reproduction of Native Americans, but if you integrate the two populations together, you get less and less of what people would consider to be purely Native American, as opposed to white people with Native American heritage. And a lot of people in the United States are like me. They have like enough to say, well, yeah, there's some history in my family where there's Native American heritage, but not enough to be like a member of a tribe or, you know, any kind of. I've learned some about the culture of the tribes that are in my family history, but it wasn't stuff that was handed down in my family. Aside from Three Sisters soup, which wasn't called Three Sisters soup when I learned how to make it, and probably wasn't the original recipe either. So, food gets handed down better than everything else, I guess. But, so as all this is going on, there is still the East India Companies. And voting in the U.S. didn't change a whole lot until after the American Civil War. And then a whole bunch of shit happened. So you have the Civil War, 2 years, 2 months long. in the middle of the Civil War, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached the third year. And, of course, the proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforth shall be free. What people don't necessarily realize about this was that this was a strategic attack on the South. Right, you end slavery in the South in the middle of the war. It was intended to cripple their operations, because the slaves could just leave, and they did. So many of them formed brigades and fought on the Union side. So, as a result of that, and we're going to get to it, we have the 15th Amendment. Right before the 15th Amendment, we have the 14th Amendment, which defined citizenship, granted citizenship to former slaves, also established due process and equal protection under the law. And that was June 16th, 1866. I believe that's when it was ratified. I'm going to double check here. Yeah. Let me make sure I've got the date right, because... Yeah, June 16th. Okay. That's not the right date according to this, though. There we go. On June 16th, 1866, the House Joint Resolution proposing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was submitted to the states. So that's when it was submitted to the states. And then it was ratified on July 9th, 1868. So you have had the right to due process since then. And then we have two acts in Canada. The British North American Act. This is when Canada became a country. Canada is formed with only men who are 21 years of age or older and who own property been able to vote in federal elections. People are excluded from voting provincially, also cannot vote federally. So there's the voting rights there. And then we have they actually passed a law, post-election confederation, and men over the age of 21 who meet property qualifications can vote. Oh, no, it wasn't that they passed the law. It was the first election after the Confederation. So they had the first election shortly thereafter. And right after that, we have the 15th Amendment. So one of the things that I want to talk about with regard to the 15th Amendment, and we will start with that in the next episode, was how the suffragettes reacted to advocacy for it. Did I knock you out, Lauren? I think I did. I think I got her sleeping because of the dryness of the little bit of history in between. But so I'm probably gonna call it here because it's almost 9 o'clock. But I will point out. So it took after the end of the Civil War, right? Civil War ends April 9th, 1865. Former slaves get their citizenship, 1866. And then it's 1869 when they get their voting rights. The right to vote is guaranteed to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what ends up happening, though, is it doesn't actually give all men the right to vote. Right. And while it's in debate, we have the suffragettes going ballistic. They didn't like it. They didn't want it passed. They were mad that it was going to get passed before women got their voting rights, and they protested against it. They argued against it. So there's some things that we will discuss about the suffragettes in the United States and in the UK next week. And we'll get more into the 15th Amendment. And then also next week we will be looking at, from the 15th Amendment on, you can see there were a whole bunch of different things passed that limited people's right to vote. And actually, when they updated this, it looks like they duplicated some of my things, because I just saw some. I'm going to have to go back and make sure this isn't screwed up. I got notices this morning that this site that I've got my timeline on has been through some sort of update as well, and some of the stuff on it doesn't look right now, so I'll have to go back and double check and make sure everything is the way it's supposed to be. But this is basically what was going on, and I think there may be some things I need to add from Australia as well, and possibly some more things that took place in Ireland. But as you can see, looking ahead here, there are several different things that took place in the U.S., court cases, laws, and so on. Those are all things that affected the right of suffrage in the U.S. Yeah. Yeah. OIC and Wowie says that feeling when data is destroyed by a back-end engineers. And yeah, that's kind of the case. It's not gone. It's just out of place. It doesn't look like it's in the right spot. And I think something I read off tonight might have been in the wrong spot as well. So, because I see the duplicate of it, I suspect that it is an earlier version of it where I had I had accidentally copy pasted the wrong date, and so it put it in the wrong spot, and I deleted that one. And it's back because the correct one appears to be up here. But I might be wrong about that. The Gradual Enfranchisement Act. So, all right. In any case, we'll go through more of that next week. Let me see if I do have any further chats. Did I read? I think I read this one, but Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, look up Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe if you want to learn about the end of slavery in Canada. Upper Canada is Ontario, lower is Quebec. I think I did, because one of the few things I know how to pronounce correctly is Quebec. Because I got corrected on that a bunch of times. Let's see. Yeah, OIC and Wowie says, when the development team goes, you don't understand, we need to move the button by 2 pixels to improve our ad performance. That's probably true. I don't begrudge them money. This is quite a thing to be able to use. It's a very nice tool to have. So if you want to make something like this, like now, I had to get the professional level to make a timeline this big and keep it from being editable by other people while I'm working on it. But this time.graphics is the basic web address is probably time.graphics.com. It might be a .org, but I don't have that as the. Let me look here. Let's see if I can go to their main page. Since I'm using this tool for my show a lot, I probably ought to at least give them they don't pay us or anything, but yeah, and it is like a lot of things that are free online. It's free asterisk, so there are neat things you can do with it. There are limitations to the free level, and I decided it was worth it to me to spend on the not free level, but not everybody's going to want to do that. It's not super cheap. But it's useful, and when I get done with this, I'll be able to download it, and I'll have a copy that I can create a page on the blog for it, so that we actually have it preserved. And even if I stop using the paid version of this and the timeline becomes available for editing, maybe other people might find it useful, maybe not, but we'll have the one that was created for HBR Talk regardless. So, and yeah, it's just graphics, but it's a method of organizing them that takes a lot of the work out of my hands. There's a lot of things I don't have to do because this automatically does it, that has made the process doable, in my opinion. So, but in any case, with that, and people have asked before, like, what are they paying for when I get paid for doing this? There's other things like this that I've spent money on. I've spent money on video software to create my videos. I've bought occasionally some elements to use in the videos, and so on. Yeah, it's oh, the domain is .graphics. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't even show in the web address on my computer, in the address bar. So it's kind of weird. But it does show on the title. So yeah, I guess that is, you're right. That is the, I'm used to like .com or .org or something. .graphics is different. But yeah, so this is the kind of thing that I'm able to do because I get paid to do Honey Badger Radio. So if you want to support the Badgers, and just a reminder, like at the beginning of the show, you want to go to feedthebadger.com. It is the most stable way. We could have any other means of supporting us cut off for being politically incorrect, being wrong think boogeymen. And it's not like it hasn't happened in the past where we've had suspensions or other things from different social media sites and stuff like that, and we've seen people deplatformed on Patreon and on PayPal and other sites like that. So for us, like, we created Feed the Badger specifically because we want to have a way to avoid having that happen to us. So if you want to support stuff like this, even though, like I said, this is a pretty dry sausage, but it's information that is kind of vital to understanding the history of suffrage. And as you look through, as we've just discussed this, right, everything that happened in the timeline at this point, from the bloody French Revolution to the more dry changes that were taking place around it as a result, after the bloody American Revolution, it's all stuff that was influenced by the understanding that elites could only govern with consent of the commoner, because the commoner could stand up and fight for their freedoms, their rights. So next week we'll get into changes to voting rights in the United States that took place around race, and there were also, some other changes that took place around race after women's suffrage. Well, actually, before we do that, we will get into the racism of the suffragettes, because it's important to address this, right? We hear from women that women didn't get their voting rights until men had universal voting rights for all the time in the world. That's not true. We've demonstrated that that's not true. For most of voting history, less than 6% of the population had the right to vote. And for much of it, that included women. Right? So we'll get more into that then. So the only other thing I will say is I promised to tell you at the beginning, I promised to tell you at the end of the video what it was that I did that I thought might set off hate listeners in our Rumble. So I posted a tweet with a video in it about women's suffrage. It's formatted vertically, so if you're listening or watching on your phone, currently, in the moment, it is the, I think it is the top tweet of mine. Let me look just to be sure, but I think I pinned it. And I'm not going to play it on YouTube because I'm not sure that the subject matter and the statements made will not get us suspended. So I won't tell you any more about it. You'll have to look. But yeah, it is my pinned tweet. So my Twitter handle is @Oneirosgrip. It's ONEIOROSGRIP. If you want to see that, it's about a minute and 3/4 long. And I said tonight on HBR Talk we'll discuss the evolution of suffrage in the U.S. after the U.S. Revolutionary War. The evolution of suffrage after the U.S. Revolutionary War. There's no blog post tonight because WordPress is being temperamental. It's obviously female, guys. I'm pretty sure it's on its period. But you can find us at, and then I linked, and in the meantime here, have an inflammatory video. So there you go. You can go find the inflammatory video and see what I said that I think YouTube wouldn't appreciate. I don't think it was appropriate for the platform, or we would have used it. But in any case, with that, thanks to everybody for listening to the Long Dry Sausage. Go check out the inflammatory short, the long short, and I think I'm done with all the super chats, done with all the super chows, and done with all the Rumble rants. So thanks to Lauren, although you probably are asleep and can't hear me, for sticking out this dry sausage with me. And thanks to everybody who works in background and makes HBR Talk happen. Good night, all.
Men's right activists are machines.
We will see you next Thursday.
Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.